To continue, I just want to welcome my good friend Arthur MaCcabe, former many things, and he will present us about ag data infrastructure in Arizona. But I believe that you also will tell us a little bit what you have been doing before.
A little bit, yes.
Excellent.
Okay, so we're going to try this experiment and find out if the Mac formatting changes everything when we put it on the Windows box. So I'm Barney MaCcabe. I'm between you and alcohol. I am aware of that, and we'll be very careful to make sure we don't get too far down the path. I'm going back to agriculture, so we're going to go back into the dirt. You're going to like the dirt. The soil is going to be good stuff. Before I get started, though, we respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the lands and territories of indigenous people. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. And as far as I know, I'm still allowed to say that.
Should be.
Yeah, we're going to watch. Okay, so I did follow Nicholas's instruction this time when I was supposed to say something about me, because I figured, well, it's about me. It's worth talking about. This is the stuff you can find out on the web about how I zigzagged across the country. What you probably can't figure out from the web is that back in high school, I thought I was going to go into filmmaking. That was the goal. George Lucas had just put out his first film, THX 1138, based on his student film at UCLA, right? It's kind of this amazing thing. This man coming out, and you looked at this, and eventually I realized I was not George Lucas. This was not going to be the career for me. Ended up in math. That was okay. That's what? Yeah, that's me. Okay, the mustache had not grown in yet. It took it a while.
It is.
Yeah. That's over 50 years ago.
Fair enough.
The other thing that this doesn't tell you is that right here, just before moving all the way across the country, I married my wonderful wife and promised her parents we'd be back pretty soon. 45 years later, we made it. And yes, Dan, if you're adding this up, I have been around the sun 70 times. It's okay. All right, so back into what we're going to talk about today. It's about data. And there's two themes that I've been focused on coming back to the University of Arizona. And number one, data is our commodity. Data is our value. Data is what we will have, especially in the academic environment, right? Especially in that environment, and probably in the national labs as well. Right? We will not be able to afford the energy and computing costs that are necessary going into the future, right? And so we can potentially have some of those big initiatives, but Dan, I'm sorry, you're not going to be number one, right? It's just not going to happen. I don't even think that the national labs are going to be able to have that kind of strategy going forward with the kind of funding environment we find ourselves in. So we're going to have to focus on our data. The one thing we can get, next thing you realize is we probably don't have very much of that either, because you think about astronomic data, that doesn't really belong to us at the University of Arizona, even though we have the best telescopes in the world and we build the new things. That is public data. We don't control it. It's not ours. It's created in the public interest. So we need to tap into data that's around us. And that's part of the story here. The other thing I would say is what really differentiates us in the research community is we focus on the public good, right? The ability to create capital is not really the focus, right? The focus is what can we do to improve humanity? How can we build on that? And so part of this is going to be how are we starting to think about that in agriculture data? I would tell you that my general strategy at Arizona is work with the state and every state agency to work with them to understand their data. Look at the Department of Transportation. That'll be next. Health and Human Services in Arizona. We're working on a health data commons across the state. And so we'll be looking at basically how do we get this data in a form that is useful, possibly integrable, for the public good in the state of Arizona. Theme 2, collecting data is expensive, reusing it is dangerous, right? And I think this is something we all too often forget. We have done great things going out and finding data is available. I mean, Google Translate was a phenomenal find, right? And going out and getting all of the data that had already been translated into multiple languages, using the EU, using the United Nations. But you got to be careful when you use that data. I don't think you would want to, or you wouldn't want to use Google Translate, at least in the early forms, to write a contract, right? Or to do a negotiation across nations, right? You probably need actual human beings in that, and you better be careful about what this is. It doesn't really work in casual conversation very well either, but it's kind of funny when it messes up because it's a very specialized kinds of data that they are using and collecting. So you got to be careful about that. And the point here is every data has context. You can't take it away from the context. And we frequently want to think about it's just a bunch of numbers. It's a bunch of numbers that has a big context around it, and we can't ignore that. When we try to reuse it, we may miss that original context, and that gets us to all these things about bias and all the evilness that's going on in a lot of these systems. We need to be intentional about collection, and my goal today is to talk to you about some of the things we're doing in Arizona related to agricultural data and collecting. Okay, I grew up in Arizona as a kid. If you look back at those slides, I went 6th grade through undergraduate, which means I had to learn about the economy of the state of Arizona. Arizona's, at least the economy at that time, was defined as the 5 C's. Copper, we're still #1 in copper production. Mines are beautiful, by the way. They're especially copper mines. Coal mines back in West Virginia, not so pretty. Copper mines are beautiful. They have these turquoise lakes at the bottom of them. They have those wonderful mine tailings coming out. Anyhow, copper, cattle, cotton. Cotton should surprise you. You may know about Pima cotton. If you do, frequently you'll see this as Pima cotton. Pima County, Arizona, right? This is long staple cotton that grows in the desert. Turns out that's not necessarily the best thing to do with the limited water you have in the desert. We'll come back to that. Citrus, we used to grow and produce a lot of lemons, oranges, limes, and such. And by the way, those bio-inspection stations you saw coming in, we had those on every highway coming into Arizona because we were so afraid of the citrus crop having an infection or anything coming in. And so when I grew up, we always stopped at every border. And then climate, we have the climate. It's ideal, especially in the summer. It's wonderful in the summer. Now, that's actually changed a bit. Copper, as I point out, we're still #1. And in fact, this is, Caterpillar has their proving ground now out just outside of Tucson, Arizona, for the mining and everything that goes on. This is an all-electric vehicle, right? That they do this in Tucson to say, can you survive in the heat in the summer and the cold in the winter, and actually do a lot with the copper mining in the state. Cattle really is cows now because we have a large population. It turns out cows are necessary for that. Pima cotton is, we've used up all the water we had available, so it's sort of going away. And so maybe that's turning into copper or commuting. Citrus is really crops, and I'll talk a lot about that. That's Yuma, that's leafy greens. It tells we still export a lot of our water, but now we do it by sending you lettuce, right? Or leafy greens and doing it a little different way. And then this quote is one of my favorite. Duke Pauly, who, and I'll talk about him a little bit later as well, has the comment that we have the climate of tomorrow today. So come and learn how to grow things in Arizona. Okay. This is the way, and this slide is courtesy of Connor Osgood, who runs one of the YCETA, He's the Chief Technology Officer for YCETA, which is, I'll talk about later. But basically, this gives you some more of the impact of agriculture in the state of Arizona. If you think about Arizona, you think desert, not a lot of stuff going on there. There is a major agricultural economy. It's 23 billion in economic impact, 138,000 jobs, 20,000 farms, exports to over 70 countries. These are the 15 counties of Arizona, in case you were wondering what that is, and what's produced in each of those counties in terms of an agricultural product. We're known as one of the most productive and efficient growing agricultural regions in the world and one of the most diverse agricultural production states in the nation. So that's the quote from our, okay, models. We build models from data. We have models, we use them. I want to go briefly into some of the kinds of modeling being done right now. This slide's courtesy of Mary Frances Laporte, whom I'm hoping to bring over as a postdoc to work with some of our faculty in the plant sciences. But this is sort of the notion of we build models, and this is the genetic modeling is showing this other crop called corn. Something about people like that in the Midwest or something about that. But this is sort of the yield and what you're able to do by improving the seeds. Well, how do you go through that cycle of understanding I've done this new, I've got a model, I've come up with a new variant of corn. How do I know how well it's going to work? And I'll go into that in a moment, and how do you do that process? But this is another thing that goes on. This is pictures of Yuma. Nicholas may recognize some of this. Robotic crop thinning and weeding. So, as they say here, lettuce seeds are planted with 2-inch spacing. But for ideal, they want it down to 12 inches per lettuce head. So that means you go in, and what they want to do by the 2-inch spacing, because seeds are cheap, they want to make sure that they get one every 12 inches so they don't lose anything in the middle of that. They don't lose that crop space for growing. Right now, thinning is done manually, and you may understand Yuma is right on the border of Mexico. There's a sister city right across the border, and you can imagine what happens is a large number of people come across that border every day, work in the fields, and then go back. Well, since COVID hit, that turns out not to be so easy, and it turns out they're very expensive, right? So these labor costs have gone up. They're heavily targeted, and so now they're looking at these automated thinning systems that will go through the field and weed out the appropriate, the 1 or the 11 plants that aren't going to do well out of that tight spacing that they originally planted. So this is something coming in, but they're building models underneath of the individual plants, what they're looking at. They do the same thing for weeding. Same process. These are the thinning and the weeding systems that come in, and they have to identify, is this a crop plant or is this a weed? And how do you get rid of it? How do you fertilize it? And a lot of those kinds of things. This is the fertilization management. Minimize the amount of fertilizer you're using. Work on how much, minimizing the amount of water you use. And a lot of those kinds of things go in to this. But these are independent models that are being built by the farmers. And by the way, I would point out, when DK was here, if you notice that first slide, I had spent part of my life in Ohio. In Ohio, this is terrible. When I was a kid, the worst insult you could call somebody was to call them a farmer, right? And it's like now, these people are incredibly progressive in terms of what they're, and how much of the technology they're bringing in, right? In these communities now, it's kind of a survival thing, right? For these smaller farms that we'll talk about as how that works. The virtuous cycle, I've seen this several times, nothing here, but what I want to point out is that if you're going to do this on a crop size experiment, you better be close. You cannot fail a crop, right? Because a crop is an entire field worth of that. You've just wasted a whole growing cycle. If you do that, you cannot afford that. So part of this is what do we do and how do we go about collecting data? We have some kind of interesting resources in Arizona that I want to go through and talk about. One of these is the Controlled Environment Agriculture Center, otherwise known as what you would think of as a greenhouse. These are interesting in that This one in the upper right is a prototype of a lunar greenhouse, actually intended to be used on the moon or on Mars. Either, it turns out Arizona, we do space, and so when we do anything, we add space to it. And so in this case, we're adding space to greenhouses. There's another one that's interesting here, and this is something that's coming up now, is agrivoltaics. And the idea here is we will put over the crops these solar panels that are semi-translucent. And what they do is they let through the photons that are useful for growing, but take the other ones and use them for energy production. And this has the benefit that you grow things, you get energy out of it, and you get a little shade for the plants themselves. And so you don't lose as much water, so you get a much better water retention as you're growing a crop. But we have these environments, we can put these up, very controlled, get data out of that for anything you're trying to understand in your crop life. And so you've got that as a starting point. You may know that we also have Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2 scales that up. And of course, well, we have the space analog for the moon and Mars as well as one of the components of Biosphere 2, because as I said, whatever it is, we add space to it. So this is an opportunity. We have many of the different climatic zones that you can replicate in this, you can control, you can manage, but it's obviously scaled up quite a bit in terms of what's going to happen with the environment and understanding that. And then, this is one of the cool toys. This is Duke Pauly. Duke Pauly's experiment station outside of Maricopa, and Maricopa is a small city outside of Phoenix, but this is the world's largest outdoor phenotyping platform called the Field Scanner. And it's a gantry that you would find in a shipping area, a shipping yard, that they brought out to the middle of the desert. You can imagine what people thought of when they saw that coming out here. But it scans an entire acre of land, right? And so they can run these cameras. This is the little, it'll show it again. Right in here is the cameras, and you can move that back and forth, and you get very precise indication of what's going on in the soil beneath, and you get precise location and indication. You don't get nearly that kind of precision with drones, right? So this is the advantage of this kind of a system. As it turns out, the company that built this little platform went out of business. Luckily, before they did that, they open sourced all of the technology. It is a Windows box up there. You can imagine that as well. So it's a lot of fun to play around with. But we now have an open source capability to play with that and do a lot more with understanding how crops are growing at a reasonable scale, right? So we've pulled this now out of Biosphere 2, out of a tightly controlled environment, but we can now still measure very accurately. And now I want to go into Yuma. Yuma, Arizona, and a lot of this talk's been touching on Yuma. Yuma, in case you don't know, is in the, southwest corner of Arizona. The way I always used to think of it is that's the place you got to stop when you're going to San Diego, because San Diego is the next stop if you get across the border at Arizona. Or the other way we used to think about it was when an earthquake hits in California, falls off, Yuma will give you a beach, and so we'll have a good time there. But this is the southernmost end of the Colorado River in the United States, right? So there's water coming in. It turns out to be a very interesting point in an interesting climate. So agriculture in Yuma, if you're in North America and you eat leafy greens between Halloween and Easter, there's a 90% chance they came from Yuma, Arizona. This says 80%. I think that's wrong. I've always heard 90, so I'm just going to tell you it's 90. But that's, again, one of these things that is quite a surprise, right? You're growing leafy greens in the middle of the desert, but think about the climate. It's a wonderful time for growing things in the middle of the winter where you can't grow them anyplace else, right? So Yuma actually is a year-round growing. We can grow all the year long. And it is an incredibly productive area. The other thing I would tell you about Yuma, and I'm not sure if it's here, Well, there's 230,000 acres of fertile soil, available workforce, senior water rights. So that means Western water rights are an interesting concept themselves, but that means we have existing use or claim on water coming out of the river. Great sport, progressive farmers. I don't think, and I didn't have on here, it's not these mega farms. These are bigger than family-owned farms, but not that much bigger, right? They are a large number of farms in the valley area that all abut one another. So the other thing that happens is, and I think the University of Arizona is the only, so back up, land-grant universities. So when the University of Arizona was created in 1865, it was created as part of or because of the Morrill Act, which is the land grant act that created the land grant universities in the United States. And the idea was they would give land to a state. You can imagine where that land came from. It was indigenous population land. They said, here, we'll take that and give it to you. You have the right to do with that land what you want in order to build a university. Right, so that's your economics and your economic base of the land grant mission. And so they gave the universities that. You could sell it if you wanted to. You could use it for all kinds of other things. And then they built a whole bunch of other structure around that. And partly they have and we talked about this earlier, the extension services, which is we have a branch of the University of Arizona, or at least our agricultural extension, in every county in the state. So we are connected to everybody in the state in a bi-directional network, right? So when they have issues about what's not growing, they tell us. We learn, we go back and do the research. And so we have this very tight use-driven research cycle that goes on. And then we present back to them what are the results of the newest research and how do we understand that. And so this has been a very, very successful program in the US to build this out. They also have experiment stations. And so the gantry that I showed you earlier, that's one of the experiment stations. I think we are the only land grant that has a cyber experiment station. I haven't had anybody correct me on that yet, and I don't know of any other one, but that means computation and data has been part of this for at least the last 15 years or so. Right, so it goes back to some of the stuff that we did with the iPlant and the plant sciences and computation and computational methods there, but that's been going on for 15 years. So right now, they do a lot of the technology about communication. We'll talk about that in a moment. Here are some other things. This is YCETA. YCETA is the Yuma Center for Excellence in Agriculture, or Desert Agriculture. That's DK Ponda, by the way. DK came out and visited. So they do this annual expo on all the technology. And so you see all these things that people are doing. And DK came out for that. It was kind of neat. He's taking a picture on it. This just pulls the lettuce out, and he's making sure it's doing the right thing as it's growing in the field. But it's a unique partnership. YCETA itself is housed in the University of Arizona, but it's really a public-private partnership between the growers in the Yuma Valley and the university to see how we can work together. And that's really one of the fundamental pieces about making this data thing work, right? We have a large number of small farmers or small growers in the Yuma Valley. They're a little hesitant to share their data, but they understand that when they do share their data, they'll get more out of it for themselves as well as for the rest of the community. And so YCETA is actually helping to grow that community, grow that level of trust back and forth so that the farmers don't have to openly share what they're doing, but they can have an opportunity to benefit from each other's data, right? And to make sure that those benefits stay within that community as well. So that's one of the important things. Now, I'm going to go into what we're trying to do now in Arizona about connecting up these fields and how this is working. And partly it's the county of Yuma, the county supervisors, as well as the YCETA connection and the growers. Need to back up a little bit for those of you who are not familiar with it. Under the Biden administration, they created a broadband initiative throughout the US, right? And it's part of the large growth areas, but it was intended to connect people with broadband who were underserved or unserved across the U.S., right? So it goes into a lot of the rural communities, right? So if you live in Tucson or Phoenix or Flagstaff for that matter, you've got broadband access just about every place. But if you live out in some of the more rural areas, you may not have any broadband access. Now, Arizona got about $1 billion in funding for that. And the plan that they built was we would build out the middle mile in Arizona. So the middle mile is, the networking technology terminology, the last mile is to your home, right? The middle mile is all the basic infrastructure that goes up. And then the highest level is the major telecom providers that build the big fat pipes across it. The plan in Arizona was, again, build out the middle mile, and this map shows you, essentially, we're going to connect up on the highways because there's an easy way to get that. Now, when you go up into here, you're into the Navajo Nation and the Hopi Nation, and so getting all the right-of-ways has been a big negotiation point, but they got that. They have built out already the western side of I-40, and I don't know what else they've got built. There's a big loop going around Tucson. Oh, there's an I-19 that goes down to Nogales that's built out. But because of a plan here, this became a priority, this last part. And this is, again, the Arizona plan for building out the middle mile. This is where they're going to put in the connectivity, the proposed phase 4 rural. And because of what the growers want to do in the same valley coming through here, this is the, you're tracing the Colorado River pieces in here, but coming in, this is the border over here.
Right.
This is the next part of the plan. So they prioritized building out the I-8 corridor here. This is Interstate 8 that goes right into San Diego through here. Because of the commitment from the Yuma County to build out towers in the field areas that would allow them to connect up everything that's going on in the field. So it started out with one of the NSF CC Star grants to provide the connectivity that came out of the experiment station to demonstrate this possibility of having a connected field. They have it in one of the experiment station. I may have that picture. Let's see if I've got. Nope, don't have it. I thought I had one. But they demonstrated in the experiment station, and then this is the plan that the Yuma County will put in, and I'll back up one more. This is sort of the area we're talking about mostly in this space here, but these are what the middle mile is going to do, and then their intention is to connect in, but provide this. And on each of these towers, they'll have a 10 gigabyte upload and download, covering 450 farms, by the way. So that's in the valley. You'll see there's 450 growers in there, but they'll have Wi-Fi, broadband and cellular, and the low RAN for battery and solar devices. And so the intention is to make it easy for the farmers or the growers in these areas to connect all their data into these pipes. With that infrastructure, because you can't run internet cables to all the devices that are sitting out there, they'll be able to control swarms of drones. They'll be able to have all kinds of instrumentation in the fields because of the low power battery, solar operated. So they can put all kinds of instrumentation in. And the point here is that the county is making the commitment to build the towers so that the growers will have an infrastructure. And that tells you something about that tax base that's coming in from Yuma County, right? This is Yuma County and how their economics drive. And so in some sense, they're taking those tax dollars and reinvesting them back into the farming community and growing that. And there's all kinds of things happening around this. But I would say that this is going to open up all kinds of new things coming in, and the farming community has really been very supportive of having that come in. So the data collection, this is sort of the obvious thing, right? So how big of an object can you grow, right? So if you're looking at greenhouse to biosphere to the gantry to the fields, right? And how much control, how much cost, blah, blah, blah. Just sort of pointing out that this is a hierarchy of data collection and the kinds of things you'll need to really drive these models forward and looking at that. So now, once you have this capability, what do you do with the data? Right, you're going to have to store it someplace. And so this is sort of the governance issue of how do you build that out. Some of you may know about Cyberse. Cyberse, as I mentioned before, is one of the reasons that we have a cyber experiment station as well. This is an NSF project that was funded for 15 years. It started life as something called iPlant, and the goal was to share data among plant sciences. So the first 5 years, that's essentially the community it served. The next 5 years of NSF funding, it broadened out to all of life sciences. And then the last 5 years, 15 years of funding from NSF, which is kind of unheard of, it became all science and opened up. And so we have all our astronomy data in Cyberse and a lot of other things. But it is a way of sharing and data discovery. We have versions made up for now that are HIPAA aware with Cyberse Health, Cyberse Defense's export control, and a lot of other ones that are being used in lots of other places. But that's the backbone infrastructure that we will put in for how to make the data shareable, available, and instruction. Protection. I'm not a big fan of the data will protect itself. I don't believe that. And so that we will go to the walled garden approach to say, you only have admission to this. But we will go to a function-based walled garden, and there will be different collections of functions. And so if you're familiar with US Census data, that's a function-controlled operation on data. You don't get just access to census data, but you get to it through functions. And so it can control a lot about what you do. It turns out there's only one set of functions unless you're inside, right? So you're either inside or you go through the function interface. Here I'm proposing and expect we'll need many different kinds, especially not necessarily for the plant data, but for health data, right? You can imagine a researcher needs a different set of functions who wants to do a longitudinal study across the data versus a healthcare provider versus an insurance company versus that, and they would have different functions for accessing that. But that's sort of the general model we're thinking about for control and mechanisms around protecting the data. And then the last thing is to ensure, you're probably all familiar with the FAIR principles. CARE is the data sovereignty perspective on this. And it comes from the indigenous communities, but the idea in general is you should make sure when you contribute data, you get value back from that data in a way that makes sense, right? That makes sense to you as opposed to I'm just going to give it to you and not necessarily get anything back from it. And I believe with that, that is the end of my prepared, So, questions, thoughts, discussion, alcohol coming, okay.